Hey everyone, in this video, I want to talk about a question that I've gotten asked a couple times actually. And at first I was a little bit confused by it. I wasn't sure why it was being asked. But as I thought through it, I realized that it actually kind of makes sense. And the question is, how do I access Cortex? Now, to me, I build this piece of software. I intend it to be downloaded and run on premises. To me, that the answer to that question seemed kind of obvious. You access Cortex by going to the server that you installed Cortex on. But in the world of, everything is SaaS. Lots of things are SaaS. That's actually a very valid question. How do you access Cortex? Well, there are actually a few things that uh, go into play there. First of all, obviously, there's the machine that you're installing Cortex on. If you're going to be running Cortex using Windows and IIS, and all of the instructions for all of this are detailed on our documentation site, which you can find a link to down in the video description. So, anyway, if you're running on Windows with IIS, great. IIS is a web server. It exposes uh, Cortex on port 80. But you probably don't just want to use HTTP, you probably want to use HTTPS. So now you get the complexity of finding an SSL certificate, getting an SSL certificate generated, and what the process is for that. Every organization has their own process. Either you buy a certificate from a certificate authority, or lots of organizations have their own certificate authority. And there's a certificate that's installed on everybody's computer as part of the provisioning uh, process, so that all corporate resources use the same certificate authority certificate. So they all have the same chain of trust. And you have your IT department has some process for generating certificates for internal services like Cortex. So I know there was a lot of hand waving and not a lot of concrete explanation there, but that's because with every organization, it is different. But I guarantee there is someone in your organization who knows the answer to that question. And it's basically, how do I get an SSL certificate? I have this application that I'm running internally. How do I get an SSL certificate for this? And it's going to be different than for a SaaS application because for SaaS, the vendor takes care of that, right? That's all taken care of by provisioning your tenant in the SaaS infrastructure, right? So there's that. Then there's also the question of, are there other pieces in between your machine and the IIS server? You could be using something like Azure App Proxy, I think is what it's called, which means that's another layer. And maybe that takes care of the SSL connection so that IIS doesn't have to. Well, that's another layer that someone has to configure. And depending on your particular setup, the way to do that might be a little bit different. If you have questions on that, you're more than welcome to reach out and talk to us. But if you're going through that configuration, you're probably someone knows how to do that because they've done it before, and that's why they're doing it again. That's a standard process. Um, Now, if you're using something like a container environment, Elastic Container Service in AWS, or what's the Azure thing? It's Azure Container Service, I think it might be called. There are other ways to set up those SSL connections, and other ways to set up, the domain name or the URL that you hit to get to Cortex. So I think I've gone down enough rabbit trails there to to show that some a simple question like how do I access Cortex is actually not as simple as I had initially thought. So how do you access Cortex? That could be up to your organization. That could be a discussion point. There is certainly a place you are running Cortex, right? That's an easy conversation. Where are we running Cortex? Well, you have to find a VM that is close to your SQL server, most likely a VM. Most people, even if you're running in your own data center, you're probably running in a virtualized environment. So it's going to be a VM. Set up a VM logically close to your SQL server where the data is backed up. And then from that point, you can start to think about how do you want to access Cortex? Do you want it to be a link in um, your Microsoft Apps console or your Okta Apps console? In which case, maybe the URL doesn't really matter all that much. You know, the actual details of what it is, as long as it's something that's not likely to change, and it's something that you can stick in that in that list. If you want it to be something that people bookmark, it's a little bit different, and maybe you want it to be a little bit more memorable. If it's something you want to send out and have everybody remember, cortex.myorganization.com or something like that, well, that's a choice too. But at that point, there is also configuration that needs to happen so that when people type in cortex.myorganization.com, it is able to be looked up and resolved to the actual machine that Cortex is running on. And that gets into a whole discussion of DNS and maybe domain controllers and Active Directory and that sort of thing. Um, Again, there is probably someone in your organization who knows the answer to these questions specifically for your organization. A lot of them are organization specific. Obviously, the technology is the same for everyone. This is the internet that we're talking about, but there are lots of different ways to accomplish essentially the same goal. So the actual specifics of the process are probably unique to your organization. Um, and it's just a matter of finding the person um, who can do that, who knows what the right answer is for your organization or has a strong opinion for some of the things that, ultimately it really doesn't matter. You just need to make a decision about something. There's probably someone who has an opinion. And if no one has an opinion, just pick the easiest. If you have other questions, if this created more questions than it answered, leave them down below. You can certainly find us online. You can find us on our Discord server. You can find us at the Cortex users group, which I don't think I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But there's links to all of that down in the video description to contact us, to talk to us, to schedule time with us, or of course, you can leave comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.